In the center of Indiana, where the surveyors drew their lines and declared a capital city into existence upon paper before a single foundation was laid, there existed a county that was not discovered but invented, designed by intention rather than settled by accident. Marion County bore none of the organic growth of river towns or crossroads villages that accumulated slowly over generations. Instead, it emerged as a deliberate creation, its central city platted upon a grid that ignored the meandering creeks and rolling terrain, imposing geometry upon a landscape that had known only the irregular boundaries of forest and prairie. What became of those first families who arrived to find not an established community, but merely surveyors' stakes and promises? What filled the hours and years as wilderness transformed into streets, as silence gave way to commerce, and as intention gradually manifested in brick and timber? The lives lived in Marion County during that century of becoming, ordinary lives of building and hoping and enduring, have left traces in old directories and fading daguerreotypes, yet their particular textures, their specific dailiness, rests now in a quiet beyond complete recovery. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to Marion County, Indiana, as it existed throughout that long century when a capital city grew from surveyors' stakes, when the national road brought the world to the doorstep, and when farmers and merchants, lawmakers and laborers created a community at the geographical heart of the state. Marion County was established in 1821, carved from territory that had been Delaware tribal lands until the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818. The selection of its central location for the state capital was deliberate. Indiana's constitution required the permanent seat of government to be at a point near the center of the state, and commissioners traveled the region identifying suitable sites. They chose the confluence of Fall Creek and the White River, though confluence perhaps overstates the drama of the meeting, for both watercourses moved sluggishly through low-lying, often marshy ground. The White River itself proved a disappointment to those who hoped it might serve as a commercial artery. Though substantial in volume, its course was obstructed by shallows, sandbars, and occasional rapids that prevented reliable navigation. Steamboats attempted passage in favorable seasons but could not maintain regular service. The river remained useful for local purposes, providing water, power for mills, and a boundary line, yet it never fulfilled the commercial destiny that its size seemed to promise. Fall Creek, the smaller tributary, possessed more personality if less volume. Its waters tumbled over limestone ledges in places, creating modest falls that attracted millers. The creek's valley provided slightly elevated ground less prone to flooding, and the earliest settlements clustered along its banks and the higher terraces above the White River's floodplain. The landscape was neither dramatic nor particularly welcoming. Mixed forest covered much of the county, beech, maple, oak, and hickory on the uplands, with sycamore, ash, and cottonwood in the bottomlands. Prairie openings existed in the northern and eastern portions, their grasses tall and tough, their soils rich once broken. Between forest and prairie lay a transitional zone where scattered trees stood in grassland, creating park-like prospects that required less clearing labor than dense forest. The soil varied considerably across the county's 400 square miles. The glacial till left clay loams that were productive once drained, but challenged farmers with their heaviness when wet and their tendency to crack when dry. The bottomlands offered alluvial richness, but at the cost of periodic inundation. The slight variations in elevation and drainage that mean little to the casual observer meant everything to the farmer evaluating where to locate his fields and buildings. The county was divided into townships. Center Township, containing the platted city of Indianapolis, surrounded by Washington, Wayne, Perry, Franklin, Warren, Lawrence, and Decatur townships, among others. Each developed its own character shaped by the mix of settlers, the proportion of forest to prairie, and the transportation routes that eventually crossed or bypassed them. The township remained the fundamental unit of rural administration, maintaining roads, operating schools, and providing poor relief. Indianapolis itself was platted in 1821 by Alexander Ralston, who had worked with Pierre L. Enfant on the plan for Washington, D.C. The plan reflected that influence. A grid of streets oriented to the cardinal directions, with diagonal avenues radiating from a central circle. The mile square, as it was known, was ambitious for a settlement that consisted initially of a few log structures. The Pogg family, the Noland family, the McCormick family, and others who arrived in those first years found themselves proprietors of lots that existed only as stakes and coordinates. The construction of the State House, the governor's mansion, and other public buildings proceeded slowly through the 1820s and 30s, hampered by limited funds and the logistical difficulties of obtaining materials and skilled labor. Yet the presence of government employment, however modest, provided an economic foundation that purely agricultural settlements lacked. The climate was continental and variable, hot, humid summers and cold winters, with spring and autumn offering pleasant interludes, but also the potential for violent weather. Thunderstorms rolled across the flat terrain with dramatic displays of lightning and heavy rain. Tornadoes, though infrequent, were known and feared. The seasonal cycle governed life as it did everywhere, yet the absence of nearby hills or mountains meant weather could be observed approaching from great distances, providing both warning and a sense of vulnerability. Water supply was a persistent concern. Wells were dug to considerable depths before reliable sources were struck, and their water often carried mineral tastes and required settling. Cisterns collected rainwater, which was softer and preferable for washing, though requiring protection from contamination. The city would later develop public waterworks, but for most of the century, each household managed its own water supply, and droughts brought genuine hardship. The landscape held little drama. No mountains, no great forests of ancient trees, no spectacular waterfalls. It was a gentle, repetitive terrain that revealed its character slowly. Those who arrived expecting the picturesque were disappointed. Those who came to farm and build found land that would respond to labor, soil that would produce, and a location that would, in time, prove central to the state's commerce and communication. The National Road, authorized by Congress in 1806 to connect the eastern seaboard with the western territories, reached Indianapolis in 1827, transforming the settlement's prospects. This engineered thoroughfare, graded, drained, and surfaced with gravel or macadam, was the finest road most travelers had experienced. It entered the county from the east, passing through Cumberland and Germantown before arriving at the capital, then continuing westward toward Terre Haute and the Illinois border. The road brought the world to Marion County. Conestoga wagons, stagecoaches, drovers with herds of cattle and hogs, and families moving westward all traveled its course. Taverns and inns spaced at intervals provided meals and lodging, becoming social centers where news was exchanged and business conducted. The Huston Tavern, the Browning House, and similar establishments served travelers and locals alike, their proprietors gaining reputations for hospitality or parsimony that spread along the road network. Stagecoach service on the national road operated with impressive regularity, connecting Indianapolis to eastern cities and points west. The journey from Indianapolis to Columbus, Ohio, required approximately 30 hours, with stops for meals and fresh horses. Passengers endured cramped conditions, clouds of dust in dry weather, and mud in wet, yet the service represented the height of transportation technology before the railroad era. The Michigan Road, authorized by the state, ran north-south through the county, connecting the Ohio River towns to Michigan City on Lake Michigan. This route intersected the National Road in Indianapolis, creating a crossroads that enhanced the capital's commercial importance. Farmers in the county's northern townships could haul their grain south to Indianapolis, while those in the southern portions benefited from access to northern markets. Other roads developed organically, following section lines or connecting settlements. The quality varied enormously. Some were barely improved traces, others received regular maintenance through township labor requirements. Corduroy roads, constructed by laying logs across marshy sections, provided passage through otherwise impassable wetlands, but offered a jarring ride that tested both vehicle and passenger endurance. The Central Canal, part of an ambitious internal improvements program, was begun in 1837, intended to connect Indianapolis to the Wabash and Erie Canal system. The project consumed substantial resources, but was never completed as envisioned. Only a portion within Marion County was finished, providing limited commercial utility, but serving as a source of water for the city and eventually for limited industrial purposes. The canal's failure illustrated the limits of state resources and the challenges of canal construction in areas without dramatic elevation changes that facilitated lock operation. Bridges were essential infrastructure, and their construction and maintenance occupied ongoing attention. Covered bridges, which protected the structural timbers from weather, spanned Fall Creek and other watercourses, becoming landmarks in their own right. The Michigan Road Bridge over the White River was a particular point of pride, substantial enough to carry heavy wagons year-round. Population growth followed transportation improvements. Census records show Marion County's population increasing from approximately 1,200 in 1820 to nearly 8,000 by 1840. Indianapolis itself grew more rapidly, reaching approximately 27,000 residents by 1840. The remainder of the population was distributed across the townships, where farming remained the primary occupation. The settlers came from diverse origins, though certain patterns predominated. Many arrived from the upland South, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee, bringing cultural patterns and agricultural practices from those regions. Others came from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, creating a cultural mix that sometimes produced tension but generally resulted in accommodation. The Quakers established a significant presence, bringing with them commitments to education, social reform, and plainness of living. The Friends established meeting houses, schools, and a reputation for integrity in business dealings. The Morris, the Cofton, and the Harvey families were prominent among the Quaker community, their influence extending beyond their numbers. German immigrants began arriving in the 1840s and 50s, settling primarily in the city where they established shops, breweries, and craft enterprises. Their cultural institutions, churches, singing societies, and mutual aid associations added diversity to the community and occasionally provoked nativist resentment, though relations remained generally peaceful. The farms of Marion County followed patterns common to the middle latitudes of the Midwest: mixed agriculture with corn and wheat as primary grains, hogs and cattle as principal livestock, and gardens and orchards providing household subsistence. The work was demanding but not distinctly different from farming elsewhere, and families developed routines that balanced field labor, livestock care, and domestic production. Corn dominated the acreage, for it produced reliably on newly broken land and served multiple purposes. Some was consumed as meal for human food, more was fed to livestock, and a portion was distilled into whiskey. The planting occurred in May, the stalks growing rapidly through the humid summer months. Harvest began in autumn, with ears picked by hand and husked either immediately or at leisure during winter months. Wheat cultivation required more careful management. Sown in autumn, the crop overwintered as green shoots, then resumed growth in spring. Harvest came in June or early July, demanding intensive labor. The grain was cut with cradles, bound into sheaves, shocked in the field to dry, then hauled to the barn for thrashing. Mechanical reapers appeared in the county during the 1850s, gradually replacing the cradle and dramatically reducing labor requirements. The thrashing itself was often communal work, with neighbors assisting each other in rotation. The thrashing machine, initially horse-powered, later steam-driven, separated grain from straw with efficiency that hand flailing could not approach. The work was dusty, hot, and exhausting, yet the camaraderie and the satisfaction of seeing the golden grain accumulate in bags provided compensation beyond the purely economic. Hogs were the most profitable livestock for most farmers. They required less land than cattle, converted corn into meat efficiently, and could be driven to market on foot. The autumn hog drive, with farmers herding their animals along roads to Indianapolis for sale, became an annual event. The Williams, the Johnson, and the Fletcher families built reputations for raising quality hogs that commanded premium prices. Cattle served multiple purposes. Milk cows provided dairy products, oxen supplied draft power, and beef cattle could be sold when cash was needed. The dairy work fell largely to women and daughters, who milked morning and evening, processed the milk into butter and cheese, and managed the sales or barter of surplus production. The Morris, Hadley, and Wilson families operated substantial dairies that supplied the Indianapolis market. Sheep were kept for wool primarily, though mutton supplemented the diet. Shearing occurred in spring, and the wool was either processed at home or sold to merchants who consolidated it for shipment to eastern mills. The domestic textile industry declined as manufactured cloth became more available and affordable, yet many farm families continued to produce at least some of their own fabric through mid-century. Orchards were established as soon as farms were sufficiently developed. Apple trees, once established, required less labor than annual crops and produced reliably for decades. The fruit was consumed fresh, dried for winter storage, made into cider and vinegar, and fed to livestock. Cider production was substantial, with nearly every farm maintaining a press and consuming the product in quantities that would seem remarkable by later standards. Gardens supplied vegetables for household consumption, with surplus sometimes sold in the city market. Potatoes, beans, peas, squash, cabbage, onions, and root vegetables grew reliably. Preserving the harvest for winter use occupied substantial time and skill. Drying, pickling, root cellaring, and eventually canning once that technology became available. Farm architecture evolved from log construction toward frame and eventually brick. The initial cabin, often a single room with a loft, was replaced as prosperity allowed by a larger frame house with multiple rooms and refinements such as glazed windows and plastered interior walls. Barns grew larger and more specialized, with sections for different purposes and livestock. The progression from primitive to improved structures was visible across the landscape as farms matured. The farmer's year followed the eternal cycle, plowing and planting in spring, cultivating and haying in summer, harvesting in autumn, and maintenance work in winter. The specifics varied by farm and family, yet the overall pattern was universal, repeated generation after generation, with only gradual change in techniques and tools. The farmhouse was a center of production as much as a residence. The labor required to sustain a household, preparing food, producing cloth, making clothing, preserving harvests, managing children, occupied women fully and demanded both skill and stamina. The division of labor was clear, with men responsible for field work and heavy labor, women for domestic production and childcare, though both spheres occasionally required crossing these boundaries. Cooking was accomplished at the hearth, or later on cast-iron stoves that offered better temperature control and freed women from constant bending. Bread baking occurred several times weekly, with the process beginning by tending the sourdough starter or preparing yeast, mixing and kneading the dough, allowing it to rise, then baking in ovens whose temperature could only be judged by experience and the evidence of previous attempts. Meals were substantial and plain. Meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, and dairy products formed the core, with seasonal variations providing occasional diversity. The evening meal was the day's largest, served after fieldwork concluded, bringing the family together after hours of separate labor. The ritual of shared eating reinforced family bonds and provided opportunity for conversation, planning, and the transmission of values across generations. Laundry remained one of the most dreaded tasks. Monday was traditionally washing day, with water drawn or pumped, heated over the fire or stove, and poured into large tubs. Clothes were scrubbed against washboards with lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat, rinsed, wrung by hand, and hung to dry. In winter, the clothes froze on the line and had to be finished indoors. The labor left women exhausted, their hands raw from the harsh soap and hot water. Sewing occupied countless hours. Clothing was made at home from purchased or homespun fabric, cut according to patterns that were memorized or roughly sketched, and stitched by hand or, after mid-century, by sewing machine for those who could afford that costly but transformative device. Mending was constant, as garments were worn until thoroughly exhausted, then cut down for children or incorporated into quilts that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Children were economic assets as well as emotional bonds. They began contributing to household labor from early ages, gathering eggs, carrying water, feeding chickens, bringing in firewood, and performing other tasks scaled to their capacity. As they grew, their responsibilities expanded, with boys transitioning toward field work and livestock care, girls toward domestic production and childcare. Education, when it occurred, was subordinated to labor demands. District schools operated in the townships, typically single-room structures heated by wood stoves, with attendance fluctuating seasonally as children were needed for farm work. Teachers were sometimes well-trained, often poorly prepared, and frequently young women for whom teaching provided a brief interval of employment before marriage. The curriculum emphasized basic literacy and numeracy, using whatever textbooks were available and enforcing discipline with varying degrees of strictness. Social life centered on churches, which served religious, social, and community functions simultaneously. Methodist circuit riders had been among the earliest religious presence, establishing congregations that built modest frame or brick buildings as resources allowed. Baptist, Presbyterian, Christian, and other denominations followed, creating a landscape of competing yet overlapping religious communities. Camp meetings and revivals provided intense religious experience and social connection. Families traveled distances to attend, camping for days while preachers delivered sermons, hymns were sung with fervor, and conversions were sought and celebrated. These gatherings combined spiritual renewal with practical opportunities for courtship, trade, and the exchange of news. Medical care was primarily domestic, with women maintaining knowledge of herbal remedies and nursing practices passed down through generations. Doctors existed, but were expensive and of variable skill. Childbirth was attended by midwives, usually experienced older women who served their communities in this capacity. Infant and child mortality remained high, and most families experienced the loss of at least one child, often more. The small gravestones in family plots and township cemeteries testified to this ever-present sorrow. Perhaps you find yourself now in some quiet place, far removed from Marion County's flat prairie forest landscape, yet the past we explore together is not so distant. The concerns that occupied those families, providing food, shelter, and future for children, finding meaning in labor, creating community amid isolation, these remain human constants. If these quiet histories bring you peace in this hour, consider subscribing to this channel, marking your presence in our register as those families marked theirs in township records and cemetery stones. Let this small gesture signify your commitment to preserving memory against the vast forgetting that time brings. Indianapolis developed through mid-century from a modest county seat into a genuine city, its growth driven by its role as state capital, its position at the intersection of major roads, and eventually the arrival of railroads. The population reached approximately 8,000 by 1850, 18,000 by 1860, and continued upward through subsequent decades. The cityscape evolved from predominantly log and frame construction toward brick and stone. Fire posed constant danger, and several conflagrations prompted both insurance requirements and building code changes that mandated masonry construction in commercial districts. The Fletcher family, the Morris family, and the English family were among those who erected substantial brick commercial buildings that suggested permanence and prosperity. The State House underwent expansion and improvement, reflecting Indiana's growth and prosperity. The structure dominated the city's skyline, its dome visible from approaching roads, serving as both practical government building and symbolic representation of Republican governance. Legislative sessions brought lawmakers, lobbyists, and petitioners to the city, stimulating commerce and creating seasonal employment. Retail establishments multiplied and specialized. General stores gave way to shops focusing on particular goods, dry goods, hardware, groceries, drugs, books. The proprietors, the Nordyke, the Bates, the Talbot families, among others, often lived above or behind their stores, blending residence and business in patterns typical of the era. Credit extended to known customers, and account books tracked debts that might persist for years before settlement. Manufacturing began modestly but grew steadily. Flour mills, foundries, carriage makers, furniture manufacturers, and various other enterprises established operations. The availability of labor, access to agricultural products requiring processing, and connections to markets via road and later rail created favorable conditions for industrial development. The arrival of the first railroad, the Madison and Indianapolis line, in 1847 marked a transformative moment. Rail service offered speed and reliability that stagecoaches could not match, and freight rates fell dramatically below wagon transportation costs. Additional railroads followed, converging on Indianapolis and creating a network that enhanced its role as distribution center. Union Station, eventually constructed to consolidate the various lines, became an architectural landmark and symbol of the city's aspirations. Hotels proliferated to accommodate the increasing numbers of travelers. The Bates House, the Spencer House, and other establishments offered varying levels of comfort and refinement, from simple rooms with shared facilities to elegant suites with private amenities. Hotel dining rooms served as gathering places where business was conducted, political alliances formed, and news exchanged. Newspapers competed vigorously for readers and influence. The Indiana Journal, the Indiana State Sentinel, and others published daily or several times weekly, providing local news, national political coverage, commercial intelligence, and literary content. The editors, men like John DeFries and Joseph Chapman, wielded influence beyond their circulation numbers, shaping opinion and often entering politics themselves. Religious institutions multiplied and became more elaborate. The simple frame churches of early settlement gave way to substantial brick and stone edifices with towers, stained glass, and organs. Christ Church Episcopal, Second Presbyterian, Roberts Park Methodist, and others erected buildings that combined worship space with social halls and Sunday school rooms. These churches served not only spiritual needs, but also provided social networks, charitable services, and markers of social standing. German immigrants established their own churches, cultural organizations, and businesses, creating a distinct community within the city. The Athenaeum, built as a German social and cultural center, hosted dramatic performances, concerts, and athletic events. German breweries, bakeries, and butcher shops clustered in particular neighborhoods, maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to American circumstances. African Americans, though a small portion of the population, established churches, benevolent societies, and businesses despite facing discrimination and legal restrictions. The Bethel AME Church served as a community center and haven. Barbers, washerwomen, waiters, and laborers found employment, though opportunities remained constrained by prejudice. The Roberts family, the Tyler family, and others worked to create space for dignity and advancement within a society that often denied both. The outbreak of war in 1861 transformed Marion County as it did all of Indiana. The response was immediate. Militia companies formed, volunteers enlisted, and the city became a center for mobilization and training. Camp Morton, established on the Indiana State Fairgrounds, served initially as a training camp for Indiana troops, then later as a prisoner of war camp holding Confederate soldiers captured in Western theater battles. Marion County provided multiple regiments. The 7th Indiana Infantry, the 11th Indiana Infantry, cavalry units, and artillery batteries drew men from the county and city. The departure of these units was marked by ceremonies, speeches, and displays of patriotic fervor that gradually gave way to more somber recognition of war's costs as casualty lists began arriving. The home front organized to support the war effort. The Indianapolis Sanitary Commission, led by women including Mrs. Lou Wallace and others, coordinated the collection and shipment of supplies to Indiana regiments. Ladies' aid societies sewed uniforms, rolled bandages, and prepared provisions. fairs, and festivals raised funds for soldiers' relief and support for veterans' families. The war stimulated certain sectors of the economy. Manufacturers produced uniforms, equipment, and provisions. Farmers benefited from increased demand and rising prices for grain and meat. Yet labor shortages complicated production, and the absence of men left women, children, and elderly managing farms and businesses with reduced capacity. Camp Morton as a prisoner of war camp brought the war's reality into immediate view. Confederate prisoners, numbering in the thousands at various times, were held in barracks behind fences patrolled by guards. Conditions were harsh: inadequate food, overcrowding, disease, and winter cold claimed many lives. The small Confederate section of Crown Hill Cemetery holds the graves of several hundred men who died in captivity far from their homes. Veterans began returning in 1865, some whole, others wounded or broken by disease and hardship. The adjustment to peacetime proved difficult for many. The Grand Army of the Republic established posts that provided fraternal connection and political advocacy. Memorial services and monuments honored the fallen, and Memorial Day observance became an annual ritual of remembrance. The war accelerated certain social changes. Women had demonstrated organizational and administrative capabilities that challenged assumptions about proper female roles. The abolitionist cause, long championed by Quakers and other reformers, achieved its goal with emancipation, though the struggle for racial equality would persist far beyond slavery's end. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument, eventually constructed on the circle at the city's center, became the most visible memorial. Planning began shortly after war's end, though construction was delayed by funding challenges and design debates. The monument's eventual completion created a civic landmark and gathering space that anchored the city's identity. The war's economic stimulus continued into the post-war period. Railroad expansion accelerated, manufacturing diversified, and the city's population growth rate increased. Indianapolis emerged from the war more urban, more industrial, and more connected to national currents than it had been in 1861. The African American population increased during and after the war, as formerly enslaved people sought opportunities in northern cities. Indianapolis's Black community grew, establishing additional churches, schools, and businesses despite facing continued discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. The struggle for full citizenship and equality became a defining feature of post-war civic life. The war marked a generational divide. Those who served carried experiences that shaped their understanding of citizenship, sacrifice, and national identity. Those who came after inherited a reunited nation, but lacked the transformative experience that had created it. The tension between memory and forgetting, between honoring sacrifice and moving forward, would persist through the remaining decades of the century and beyond. The final third of the century witnessed Indianapolis's transformation from regional commercial center to industrial city. Manufacturing diversified beyond flour milling and craft production to to include meatpacking, iron and steel products, pharmaceuticals, and various consumer goods. The Eli Lilly Pharmaceutical Company, established in 1876, would become one of the city's most significant employers and economic contributors. The meatpacking industry grew substantially, processing hogs and cattle driven or shipped from surrounding agricultural regions. The Kingen Company and other packers operated large facilities along the railroad lines, where livestock arrived, were slaughtered and processed, then shipped as dressed meat or preserved products. The work was seasonal, hard, and poorly paid, yet it provided employment for many recent immigrants and rural migrants. Streetcar systems, initially horse-drawn and later converted to electric power, facilitated residential development beyond the original mile square. Neighborhoods developed along the streetcar lines, Irvington, Woodruff Place, and others, each with distinctive character. These suburbs offered single-family homes with yards, a retreat from the increasingly crowded and industrial urban core while remaining connected by transit. Infrastructure improvements transformed daily life. Water systems expanded, drawing from wells and later from the White River and distant reservoirs. Sewage systems replaced individual privies and cesspools, though the installation proceeded slowly and never reached all neighborhoods. Gas lighting gave way to electric lighting in the 1890s, and telephone lines connected businesses and eventually residences, shrinking distances and accelerating communication. Public education expanded and improved. The city erected substantial school buildings, brick structures with multiple classrooms, indoor plumbing, and playgrounds. Attendance became more regular and consistent as child labor laws and compulsory education requirements gradually took effect. High schools provided secondary education, preparing students for college or commercial careers. Cultural institutions proliferated. The Indianapolis Public Library opened, providing free access to books and periodicals. The Art Association organized exhibitions and classes. Musical societies offered concerts and encouraged amateur participation. Theaters presented dramatic performances, vaudeville, and eventually moving pictures. These institutions reflected both growing prosperity and an aspiration toward cultural sophistication. Labor organization emerged as workers sought better wages and conditions. Skilled craftsmen formed trade unions, and eventually unskilled workers attempted organization despite employer resistance. Strikes occurred, sometimes resulting in violence and always exposing class tensions that genteel society preferred to ignore. The Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, and other organizations established local assemblies and lodges. Women's roles continued to evolve. Middle-class women organized clubs devoted to literature, music, and social reform. The suffrage movement gained adherents, though Indiana would not grant women voting rights until federal constitutional amendment compelled it. Women entered the workforce in larger numbers, primarily as teachers, nurses, saleswomen, and factory operatives, though their wages remained substantially below men's for comparable work. Immigration brought increasing ethnic diversity. In addition to Germans, who remain the largest immigrant group, smaller numbers of Irish, Italians, Poles, and Jews arrived, each group establishing neighborhoods, churches or synagogues, mutual aid societies, and ethnic newspapers. These communities maintained cultural traditions while gradually adapting to American patterns, creating hybrid identities that enriched the city's social fabric. Architecture reflected changing tastes and technologies. The Italianate and Gothic revival styles of mid-century gave way to Second Empire, Romanesque revival, and eventually early skyscraper styles. The use of structural steel allowed buildings of unprecedented height, though Indianapolis did not develop skyscrapers to the extent of larger cities. Residential architecture ranged from workers' cottages to substantial Victorian homes with elaborate trim, bay windows, and wraparound porches. Parks and boulevards were developed according to a city beautiful movement philosophy that viewed planned green space as essential to urban health and civic virtue. Crown Hill Cemetery, established in 1863, served as both burial ground and park, its rolling landscape and mature trees providing a picturesque setting for contemplation. Riverside Park, Military Park, and others provided recreational space for residents across class lines, though some facilities remained segregated by race. While Indianapolis industrialized and urbanized, the townships retained their predominantly agricultural character through centuries' end. Yet farming itself changed as mechanization advanced, markets became more distant and impersonal, and the economic calculus of agricultural production shifted. Mechanical reapers, mowers, and eventually combines reduced labor requirements dramatically, allowing families to cultivate larger acreages or to send sons to town for wage work. The investment required for machinery forced farmers into commercial relationships with banks and equipment dealers, and debt became a more common feature of farm finance. Dairy farming became more specialized as urban markets grew. Farms close to Indianapolis sold fluid milk, which required daily delivery and presented spoilage challenges. Farms farther out produced butter and cheese, which could be transported longer distances. The establishment of creameries, where milk from multiple farms was pooled and processed, represented a transition from household to industrial production. Fruit and vegetable farming for urban markets became significant in townships with rail or road access to the city. Market gardens supplied fresh produce, and orchards provided apples, pears, and other tree fruits. The relationship between rural producers and urban consumers became more mediated through wholesalers, commission merchants, and retail grocers, distancing farmer from ultimate customer. Tenant farming increased as the century progressed. Some landowners accumulated additional parcels and rented them to families who lacked capital to purchase land. Tenancy arrangements varied: cash rent, share cropping, or hybrid arrangements, but all represented a departure from the Jeffersonian ideal of independent proprietorship. Rural social institutions adapted to changing circumstances. The Grange, a farmers' organization combining social, educational, and political advocacy functions, established chapters throughout the townships. Grange halls hosted meetings, lectures, and social events, providing farmers with collective voice in an economy increasingly dominated by railroads, grain dealers, and manufacturers. Rural free delivery of mail, telephone service, and improved roads gradually reduced rural isolation. Farm families could order goods from mail-order catalogs, read newspapers and magazines delivered to their mailboxes, and telephone neighbors or businesses. The psychological distance between rural and urban life diminished even as economic distinctions persisted. One-room schools remained the norm in townships, though consolidation discussions began. The quality of rural education lagged behind urban systems, as townships struggled to attract qualified teachers and maintain adequate facilities. Yet literacy remained high, and the commitment to public education persisted despite the challenges. Churches remained central to rural social life, though denominational lines sometimes divided communities as much as they united them. Camp meetings and revivals continued as seasonal events drawing families from wide areas. The emotional intensity of earlier revivals moderated somewhat, but the social functions persisted: courtship opportunities, business connections, and community identity formation. The landscape itself bore witness to a century's transformation. The forests that had covered much of the county at settlement were reduced to scattered woodlots. The prairie openings were entirely under cultivation. The wetlands had been drained, the streams often channelized, and the entire terrain bore the impress of human intention. Yet pockets of the earlier landscape persisted, ancient trees preserved as boundary markers, streams in remote corners still flowing freely, and place names recalling indigenous presence or pioneer families. The relationship between rural and urban Marion County was symbiotic yet increasingly unequal. Farmers depended on the city as market and source of goods, services, and cultural opportunities. The city depended on the countryside for food and as a reservoir of labor. Yet the terms of exchange favored urban interests, and farmers increasingly felt themselves at a disadvantage in negotiations over prices, credit, and political representation. Marion County at century's end was a place of contrasts: urban and rural, industrial and agricultural, prosperous and struggling, progressive and conservative. The population exceeded 170,000 in the 1890 census, with Indianapolis itself accounting for approximately 105,000. The city had achieved recognition as a regional capital and aspiring national city, while the townships retained rural character despite proximity to urban development. Social stratification was pronounced. The wealthy industrialists, merchants, professionals lived in substantial homes in fashionable neighborhoods, employed servants, belonged to exclusive clubs, and traveled for pleasure. The middle class, shopkeepers, clerks, skilled craftsmen, and professionals of more modest means, aspired to respectability through home ownership, church membership, and education for their children. Working-class families, factory operatives, laborers, domestic servants, struggled with irregular employment, inadequate housing, and limited prospects for advancement. Ethnic and racial divisions cross-cut class lines. German Americans had achieved substantial economic success and social integration while maintaining cultural distinctiveness. African Americans faced persistent discrimination despite the presence of a small but growing middle class. Newer immigrant groups, Italians, Poles, Jews, occupied uncertain positions, neither fully excluded nor fully accepted, building communities and seeking advancement within a society that viewed them with varying degrees of suspicion. Gender roles remained constrained by law and custom despite modest expansion of opportunities. Women could not vote, faced legal disabilities in property ownership and contract, and were largely excluded from professions beyond teaching and nursing. Yet women's organizations, clubs, charitable societies, temperance groups, and suffrage associations created spaces for collective action and developed leadership that would eventually challenge existing limitations. Education had become nearly universal at the elementary level, and high school attendance was increasing though far from universal. Butler University, established by the Christian Church, provided higher education, and several business colleges trained students for commercial careers. The commitment to education reflected both democratic ideals and practical recognition that an industrial economy required literate, numerate workers. Entertainment diversified beyond church socials and family gatherings. Theaters presented vaudeville, dramatic performances, and eventually moving pictures. Sporting events, baseball particularly, drew enthusiastic crowds. Bicycling became popular among both men and women, offering recreation and independence that challenged conventional notions of proper feminine behavior. Parks and resorts provided leisure opportunities across class lines, though some facilities remained segregated. Literature and journalism flourished. James Whitcomb Riley, the Hoosier poet, achieved national recognition for verses celebrating Indiana rural life in dialect. Booth Tarkington would soon begin publishing novels set in Indianapolis that captured the city's character and aspirations. Newspapers multiplied and competed, providing news, opinion, and literary content to readers across the spectrum of literacy and sophistication. Reform movements addressed urban problems that accompanied growth. Settlement houses modeled on Jane Addams's Hull House provided services to immigrants and the poor. Public health campaigns targeted disease and unsanitary conditions. The temperance movement continued to press for restrictions on alcohol sales and consumption, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union particularly active. Technology continued to transform daily life at an accelerating pace. Electric lighting, telephones, indoor plumbing, streetcars, and eventually automobiles, though these remained rare luxuries at century's end, created patterns of living unimaginable to the pioneers who had arrived 80 years before. The psychological distance between 1820 and 1900 was immense, far greater than the mere years suggested. Memory became contested terrain. The pioneers were passing, and their grandchildren's generation had no direct knowledge of settlement conditions. Historical societies collected documents and artifacts, published reminiscences, and erected markers commemorating early events and settlements. The process of historical memory construction was selective, emphasizing certain narratives, pioneer courage, progress, American values, while eliding others, particularly the displacement of indigenous peoples and the contributions of those outside the white Protestant mainstream. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument, completed in 1898, stood as the most visible symbol of civic pride and historical memory. Its dedication drew thousands, and the structure dominated the city's center, serving both as memorial and as focal point for civic celebrations and public gatherings. The monument represented a particular understanding of history, one that emphasized sacrifice for Union and nation while leaving other narratives in shadow. Marion County at the close of that century bore little resemblance to the thinly settled territory of 1821. What had been forest and prairie was now farmland and city. Where surveyors' stakes had marked a theoretical capital, a substantial urban center now stood, connected by rail to the nation and by ambition to a future that seemed limitless. The transformation was nearly complete. Wilderness had become civilization, intention had manifested in brick and iron, and the ordinary labor of thousands had created a community. The population had grown from hundreds to hundreds of thousands. The economy had diversified from purely agricultural to industrial and commercial. The landscape had been fundamentally altered, with only scattered remnants suggesting what had existed before settlement. The social fabric had become complex, stratified by class, divided by ethnicity and race, yet held together by shared space, institutions, and a belief in progress. The families who had cleared the first farms and built the first structures in Indianapolis had passed, leaving descendants who inhabited a world their grandparents would have struggled to comprehend. The pace of change had accelerated across the century, and the distance between 1820 and 1900 was psychological as well as temporal. Technologies, social patterns, and cultural assumptions had shifted fundamentally. Yet continuities persisted. Farming, though transformed by mechanization and commercialization, remained governed by the seasonal cycle and the vagaries of weather. Family remained the fundamental social unit, though its functions had been partially assumed by schools, welfare agencies, and other institutions. Churches continued to provide spiritual sustenance, social connection, and moral guidance, though their authority faced challenges from secular alternatives. The physical landscape bore witness to a century's labor. The buildings, houses, barns, churches, commercial blocks represented countless individual decisions and the accumulated efforts of builders, craftsmen, and laborers. The roads that connected farm to city, the rail lines that connected Indianapolis to distant markets, the waterworks and sewers that made urban life tolerable, all testified to the capacity for collective action in pursuit of improvement. The graveyards held the physical remains and marked the memory of those who had created Marion County, pioneers who had arrived when Indianapolis was merely surveyors' stakes, farmers who had broken the prairie, craftsmen who had built the buildings, workers who had dug the canals and laid the rails, women who had maintained households and raised children, soldiers who had marched away. Their individual stories, most now lost beyond recovery, collectively composed the county's history. Memory was imperfect and selective. Official commemorations emphasized certain narratives while neglecting others. The indigenous peoples whose displacement made settlement possible remained largely absent from public memory. African Americans, whose labor and aspiration contributed to the county's development despite facing persistent discrimination, received minimal recognition. Women's contributions were acknowledged primarily in domestic contexts, their public roles undervalued. Yet the impulse to remember, however imperfectly, reflected a recognition that the past mattered, that the labor and lives of earlier generations deserved acknowledgement, and that understanding where a community had come from provided necessary context for decisions about where it would go. The new century would bring changes that would make the transformations of the 19th appear modest. Automobiles, aviation, world wars, mass communications, and eventually technologies unimaginable to even the most forward-thinking residents of 1899. Indianapolis would continue to grow, spreading far beyond the original mile square, eventually encompassing much of the county in urban and suburban development. The farms would diminish, many converted to residential subdivisions or commercial uses. Yet in 1899, as the century closed, Marion County stood as testament to what ordinary people could accomplish through sustained labor, collective effort, and persistent hope. From wilderness they had created farms, from surveyors' stakes they had built a city, from isolation they had forged connections, and from diverse origins they had constructed a community, imperfect, stratified, yet functional, and in its way beautiful. And thus we close the entry for Marion County. The national road no longer echoes with the rumble of Conestoga wagons, the canal boats have ceased their patient passage, and the farms that once covered the townships have given way to other uses. Yet the memory persists in the monuments and buildings that remain, in the records preserved in archives, in the family stories passed down through generations, and in the landscape itself, which still bears the impress of that century's labor. Rest well.